Hi everyone, my name is Sarah, and for my final project for Sociology of Death and Dying this semester, I decided to do a tour of cemeteries in both southwest Ohio as well as central Ohio, so kind of following the path of 71 between Cincinnati and Columbus. So when I visited each cemetery, I took video and photo footage and then also took a lot of notes. So those will be included in this video, as well as some research that I did after I visited each cemetery. So the first cemetery that I visited was the Mariemont Pioneer Cemetery in Mariemont, Ohio. And this is my hometown. It is a very small east suburb of Cincinnati. It's a really small village. The population is about 3,600 as of 2019, and it is a national landmark. The people buried here lived anywhere from the very, very late 1700s to the mid to late 1800s, which was definitely before the establishing of the city of Mariemont. So that is interesting. I'm going to have to do more research on that family. There's also a grave for Sarah Knapp Jewett. I also found some burial stones for the infant of, wasn't able to find out who the parents of it was, but there were two of those. Europeans began settling in Mariemont in this area starting in about 1786. Though it definitely should be acknowledged that the area was previously inhabited by Fort Ancient Native Americans who lived along the Little Miami River. The great majority of the tombstones that I could read were either for the Ferris or the Jewett family. And after doing research on the Ferris family, I found that the Ferris family was actually one of the first owners of the land that Mariemont is set on now. So Captain Benjamin Stites, along with his brothers, were the original purchasers of the land surrounding Mariemont. It also included other areas of Cincinnati, such as, like, if you're familiar, the Lunken Airport area. But then in 1799, they sold this land that encompasses Mariemont to the Ferris family. So this Pioneer Cemetery is one that I'd visited many times before. I've lived in Mariemont almost my entire life, so I went to elementary school there, and we had like Pioneer Day and like Mariemont History Day where we would go to different landmarks around the city, and this is one of those. I had never really learned about the history behind the Ferris family though, and I thought that was very interesting. So this next cemetery that I visited in Cincinnati is, I believe, the only active cemetery that I visited. This is the Spring Grove Cemetery and Arboretum on the west side of Cincinnati. It was chartered in 1845, and it's one of the largest nonprofit cemeteries in the United States. It's actually huge. It is 750 acres, which does make it the third largest in the U.S., I believe. Here we are at the Garden Mausoleums. Another really interesting thing that I'm noticing about this cemetery in comparison to the Mariemont Chapel Cemetery is that this one has a lot of runners in it. Because it's so big, I'm assuming that there's enough, there are enough paths around here to make like a decent 2 or 3 mile run. But it's interesting because the Mariemont Chapel one was small, and it's never something that you would visit if you weren't honoring the dead. It was planned out by Adolf Strauch, who was a renowned landscape artist at the time. The idea behind Spring Grove Cemetery was for it to be, for all of its landscape and architecture to be completely in harmony with nature. And I will say that as I was visiting, as I mentioned in the footage, that was extremely evident to me. One thing I'm noticing is that even though we are right next to 75, which is a very major highway, it's very peaceful around here. There are just so many trees, so there are a lot of birds here. It really drowns out the sound of the highway. The Spring Grove Cemetery also has no religious affiliation, unlike the Mariemont Pioneer Cemetery, which was connected to the Mariemont Community Church, which is Christian. And according to the website as well, Spring Grove is considered a major example of the American rural cemetery. The Spring Grove Cemetery was also unique because it houses 5 full-service funeral homes with up to 300 guest capacity. They also have licensed celebrant staff and grief support dogs available. Another thing about Spring Grove is I know that this is not just a cemetery, it also is like a crematory service. They have a crematory service as well as funeral homes. My initial reaction to this was that there were just so many different ways to be buried and memorialized in the cemetery. On their website too, one of their slogans is, "The canvas is yours, explore and make it your own." They offer an incredible amount of burial products, funeral services, different ways that you can memorialize your loved ones. They have private family mausoleums, granite benches, monuments, markers, cremation developments, as well as a green burial option, which I found really interesting. The green burial option constitutes a section of the cemetery where burial vaults are not required and embalming is prohibited, as well as caskets can't contain any metal components, and they have to be made out of a quick decomposing material. Because the cemetery is so large, it is a final resting place for many, many important people. This includes numerous Civil War generals, such as Joseph Hooker and William Little, businessmen like Joseph Henry Kroger, who was the founder of the Kroger retail franchise, and other Cincinnati developers like Charles West, who founded the Cincinnati Art Museum. My main takeaways from the Spring Grove Cemetery was just how huge it was. I had no idea it was going to be so enormous. I had planned to spend maybe half an hour looking around Spring Grove. It was actually a place that I visited on my way back to campus from spending Easter at home, and I ended up taking a solid 2.5 hours. Another thing that struck me that comes with, I suppose, visiting an active cemetery was that no other cemeteries I had visited had a designated infant section, and when I did visit this infant section, it definitely hit me very hard emotionally. The cemetery had the most recent graves, which went all the way up until, I believe, March of 2021, and this definitely had more of an emotional effect on me than I expected, especially having visited a newly marked grave for an infant from only last month. The other thing that was really interesting to see was how Spring Grove has a memorial walking tour. The mix between people who were working out and the people who were there visiting loved ones, placing flowers at graves, especially since it had been Easter just the day before. It was an interesting dichotomy. So the next cemetery that I visited was Cedar Creek Memorial Cemetery. This is really not far from the Cedar Creek State Park. It's a Quaker cemetery, and it used to be located near the Cedar Creek Friends monthly meeting house. So I actually stumbled upon this cemetery on accident. I was trying to find the Zion Baptist Cemetery, which is also in the Cedar Creek area, but I had trouble finding it on the map, and so it led me here. So I am at the Cedar Creek Memorial Cemetery, and it actually is not the one that I thought it was. As you might be able to tell, there is no one for miles. It's extremely peaceful. This is an extremely secluded location, but I was very surprised to find that most of the graves were decorated with either American flags or Easter decorations. First known burial here was in 1805, which means that this might have been one of the oldest cemeteries that I visited on this tour. And there are veterans from a variety of conflicts that are buried here. Actually, the first veteran that is buried in this specific cemetery served in the Revolutionary War. And then the last veteran was Dorotha D'Amico, who served as a nurse in World War II and died in 1964. The cemetery had a lot of family grave sites, including most notably the Johnson family, which had 6 or 7 gravestones. And this cemetery was kind of positioned so that some of the gravestones were overlooking the lake through the trees. I just found it to be really beautiful and really secluded and very peaceful. So finally I was able to find the Zion Baptist Cemetery, which is in Warren County, Ohio. And this cemetery is actually on the grounds of the Cedar Creek State Park. So I'd actually visited this cemetery back in June of 2019 when my family had been camping nearby and we decided to go on a hike. This cemetery was along one of the trails. And what's extremely interesting about this cemetery is it's also known as the Harveysburg Colored or African American Cemetery. And so this, in the old days, was considered by some as the old slave cemetery, as it was partnered with Zion Baptist African American Church in Harveysburg, Ohio. Harveysburg was the site for one of the first schools to serve minority children in the Northwest Territory. This was established in 1831. It's almost impossible to make out most of the names on these gravestones, but according to records provided by Warren County, James H. Curtis and his wife Letitia Sellers Curtis, who were married in 1884, were buried here. James Curtis's father was the son of a slave owner, and he was released from slavery in 1828, and they were originally from Virginia. James and Letitia Sellers Curtis's infant son, Hampton, is also buried alongside them. Some other gravestones that I was personally able to find and read were of Ida Mae Abel, who passed away in 1880, and then Daniel Washington, whose gravestone said U.S. Navy, and he was also marked as a Civil War veteran. Other Civil War veterans that are on record as being buried in the cemetery, but I couldn't personally find, include Benjamin Scott and William McGee. So I'd actually had no idea that the Zion Baptist Cemetery had the cultural and historical significance that it had. The cemetery itself wasn't maintained all that well. As I said, most of the gravestones are not able to be read. However, it is very convenient and very exciting that both the Cedar Creek Memorial Cemetery and the Zion Baptist Cemetery have records online that are maintained by Warren County. So I was able to see alphabetical lists of every person who was buried in both of those cemeteries, even though it was difficult to read the names.